Well, today is Thursday. It's November the 4th, and you'll have to forgive me. We are still unpacking in our home, and I'm happy, though, to be able to join you today with today's devotional from the Song of Solomon, chapter 2. The title of this devotional is Love Focuses on the Positives. Now, a little bit of the background. The love and the courtship of King Solomon and his unsuspecting but beautiful peasant maiden continues in Song of Solomon, chapter 2. Now, here we're made privy to the courtship and the affection between the king, whom I have suggested in an earlier devotion was disguised as a lowly shepherd, and the object of his affections, a young Shulamite woman, a peasant woman. Now, if you remember, she was very conscious of her appearance, her skin darkened by laboring in the sun, and yet she dreamed of her shepherd's affections, not realizing it was none other than Solomon, the king of Israel. Now, the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, opens with a dialogue between the Shulamite maiden and Solomon, whom she believes to be a shepherd. Now, she dreams of her shepherd's affections, and the young maiden professes of herself, and she says in verse 1 of Song of Solomon, chapter 2, I am the rose of Sharon. Literally, I am a rose of a cactus in the middle of the desert, and the lily, or the flower of the valleys. Now, disguised as a shepherd, Solomon admires her beauty, and he responds to her in verse 2, as the lily among the thorns, so is my love among the daughters. Well, she shared, this peasant woman, a Shulamite, shared her beloved's affections. And she says in verse 3, as the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved, thinking of the shepherd, who was none other than Solomon, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down, she says, under his shadow, that is, under his protection, with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste, perhaps speaking of his kisses. Now, as we continue, she believed that her courtship with a humble shepherd had come to understand she was, in verse 4, suddenly not the object of a shepherd's love, but the object of the king's affections. In verse 4, he says, Solomon brought her to the banqueting house, and his manner over her was love. You can imagine a peasant girl suddenly finding herself in the company of the king and in a banquet. In verse 5, secure in Solomon's presence, she asked him to stay by her side. And you and I can imagine his love and the assurance of his embrace. Verse 8, the young maiden was in love, and her beloved, the king, cherished her. Her heart leaped when she imagined hearing his voice, as she dreamed of Solomon coming to her in the strength of his manhood. And she compares it in verse 9 to like a male gazelle, a roe, or a young hart. And then she dreamed that he looked through the lattice work of her window, and he called her to himself. You know, as many young women who dream of love and marriage, this young maiden fantasized Solomon sweeping her away with his affections and rising. Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away in verse 10. She described her courtship like the passing of winter and the joys of springtime. Spring was come, and joy and love were in the air. The Song of Solomon, chapter 2, and verse 14 through 15, expresses beautifully Solomon's poetic affections. Knowing the young woman of his affections lived in the mountains, the king identified the beauty of her rural home, saying in verse 14, "O my dove," like a dove cooing in the clefts of the rock, in the secret place of the stairs. And he says, let me see thy countenance. Let me see your beauty. Let me hear your voice. Verse 14, for sweet is thy voice, that is, melodious is your voice, and your countenance is comely or beautiful. Shunning any that might intrude upon their love, Solomon described those who would interfere with his love for this young maiden as foxes that spoil the vines. Now, our scripture concluded with this young maiden expressing her love for Solomon and saying in verse 16, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." She says of Solomon, he feedeth among the lilies, that is, he grazes his sheep in the pastures. And with the shadows of daylight fading into the night, she dreamed of her beloved returning to her. Now, a closing thought in this beautiful chapter of love. My prior devotional concluded with the principle, love is not blind. My suggestion for chapter 2 is that love focuses on the positives. Solomon and his maiden gushed with words of tender love. And in verse 1, she had thought of herself as a cactus rose, but he encouraged her, no, you're like the flower of the valley. He showered her with his love and his attention, and she dreamed of him calling for her. Here's a lesson in closing. Sincere love is unconditional and focuses on the positive traits of one's beloved. Love forgets flaws and wrongdoings. Love does not drag up sins and failures. Love is kind and tender and forgiving and self-sacrificing. Love chooses to give the best. A closing question. Is your love for the Lord and for others focused on the blessings and the positives and not on the negatives? We'll continue tomorrow with our journey through this wonderful courtship of Solomon and this peasant girl. But for now, I bid you to look at your own love. Do you love unconditionally and with the spirit of forgiveness? God bless and bye-bye.